When the term survival horror is mentioned, I'm sure just like me, many of you think of all the classics at first. Series such as Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Alone in the Dark, Fatal Frame, etc. And although we usually think of these games at first, survival horror genre, although it was a bit small, still had very different and unique IPs. You have Rule of Rose, Hunting Ground, Siren, Dino Crisis. The potential was endless, to be honest. While some of these games have made their ways to modern platforms in some shape or form, some of them are still stuck in their respective consoles and times. No remakes, no remasters, no rational way to access them. If you often check discussions surrounding some of these games, you usually see the same complaints about them. How their original copies are so expensive, how rare they are, how they need remasters. You get the picture. When it comes to this specific quality, Haunting Ground, Rule of Rose, and Kuon are the three main games. All three are very hard to find, and even if you manage to find them, they're usually ridiculously expensive. There's unfortunately no legal way of playing these video games, and it's a shame because these are incredibly good, unique survival horror games, and the fact that they're slowly being erased from the face of horror gaming is a little bit sad. Today, I'm gonna talk a bit about one of these games, and depending on the reception, maybe I could talk about the other two in another video as well. But alas, today we are taking a look at Kuon, made by one of the most popular and well-liked development studios of our day. We currently know them as the makers of the Dark Souls series, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and most recently, Elden Ring. From Software has a pretty significant presence in the survival horror genre, and we're gonna talk a bit about their classic survival horror game, Kuon. Hello everybody, my name is Herc, and welcome to a new horror visuals video. Today's video, as I prefaced it already, is gonna be about Kuon, one of the most beloved and obscure survival horror games of the genre. The goal of this video is to give you some surface level information about Kuon and maybe pique your interest so you might want to try it yourself. Kuon takes place in the Heian period inside a massive estate in Kyoto, Japan. The residents of the Fujiwara Manor disappear suddenly and the game begins with this mystery. In Kuon, there are 3 playable characters in total. All 3 of these characters have their own phases in the game. Phases are somewhat like different campaigns. They're all tied to the story and roughly take place at the same time except the 3rd phase. We'll come to that later. All of them take place in the same manner. However, they all have different stories, characters, puzzles, and ranging playstyles. If you're familiar with From Software's storytelling from their Soulsborne series, then you might guess what kind of a story Kuon might have. It's not as vague or subtle as these newer games, but Kuon still has its fair share of vagueness. It doesn't really try to explain everything to you, and it requires a bit of external knowledge about Japanese traditions and beliefs. Basically speaking, the Hata clan plants 2 mulberry trees near the Fujiwara Manor. These trees, as you might guess, are magical trees. They have mystical powers. These trees produce, or rather give birth to, silkworms, which then weave cocoons as they naturally do. But the difference is, they weave these cocoons around dead people. Now, why, you ask? Why would they do that? Turns out they can resurrect dead people by doing this. But there's a caveat. This resurrection can only occur if they merge with other living beings, so it basically requires sacrifice of another life. But it is not the life itself this resurrection cares about, but it's rather the grudge of these living beings. These cocoons absorb their grudge and resurrect a new being with rather insidious motives. Mulberry trees do this to perform merging 9 times and complete the Kuon ritual at the end to give birth to a fresh, new mulberry. It's somewhat like the storytelling we are used to from Soulsborne games. There's a loop and it goes on forever until someone brave enough breaks the chain. The main story revolves around four main characters. Utsuki is one of the three playable characters, and she is also considered as the protagonist in Kuon's story. She's a shrine maiden and she lives pretty close to the manor. She's the daughter of Doman, who is the main antagonist of the game. Doman has used to be a royal exorcist and worked at the Fujiwara Manor, but later on, due to the shady business he conducted, he left the manor to become a civilian exorcist. He sees Abe no Seimei as his rival for whatever reason. I guess it's because she's simply better in every way. He wants to use her to finish the Kuon ritual. And she's also another one of our playable characters. Her phase, the Kuon phase, only unlocks after you beat the first two phases. Abe no Seimei is a powerful, wise, and just onmyoji, complete opposite of Doman in every way. Lastly, we have Sakuya. She is also one of the main playable characters. Sakuya is an intern exorcist and a disciple of Doman. Although an intern, she knows quite a lot about exorcism and she's pretty brave too, considering the events taking place in the game. Now that we briefly know about our characters, let's talk a bit about the game's plot. I won't give too many details in case you would like to play it yourself, but I will still try to give a surface level explanation of what it's about. The game begins with Utsuki and her sister Kuria arriving at the Fujiwara Manor, looking for their father. During that, in the Yang phase, our other protagonist Sakuya also arrives at the manor alongside her colleagues because they heard of some strange occurrences inside the manor. Naturally, our protagonists later meet in both of their phases and form a close relationship, considering each other as friends. They both mostly go through the same locations and face similar dangers. Throughout the events of the game, both protagonists learn of Doman's true nature and try to put a stop to his plans. But obviously it's not that easy defeating this mad scientist. Once their phases are done and the Kuon phase unlocks, Abe no Seimei, the onmyoji Doman sees as her rival, arrives at the manor. She wants to defeat Doman, stop the ritual, and save anyone she can save. Again, I can give more details, but anything I could say about the game's plot counts as a spoiler, so it's best if I don't speak much, but you get the main plot, hopefully. When you begin a fresh playthrough, you can choose either the Yin phase or the Yang phase. The third phase, which is named the Kuon phase, unlocks only after you finish the first two phases. Canonically speaking, it is recommended to start the game with the Yin phase. It is also much easier to play through and learn the game that way. Kuon has a gameplay style similar to all of your classic survival horror games from the PlayStation 2 era. Fixed camera angles, modernized semi-tanky controls, limited resources, and also limited saves. All three playable characters in Kuon can cast spells using spell cards. You can think of these as different weapons in a classic survival horror context. However, they have limited uses. Some cards in the game are so strong you can only find them a handful of times at best. There are two types of spells: summon cards and spell cards. Using the summon cards, you can summon specific creatures to appear and fight by your side for a small amount of time until they die. They're usually very reliable because of their damage output and their ability to also distract the enemies while you meditate or collect items. The other card type is for spells. These have smaller variety and you could think of them like fireballs, bigger fireballs, magical arrows, etc., as they're able to be performed from a distance. They're very reliable in most of the combat cases in the game. Additional to spells, all three playable characters also have their melee attacks. Utsuki uses blades, Sakuya uses fans, and Abe no Seimei uses a ceremonial spear. While Utsuki and Sakuya can find three variations of their weapons, Abe no Seimei only uses a single weapon and it is pretty strong anyway. At first, Kuon's gameplay feels a bit sluggish and takes a bit of your time to adjust. It's not as precise as other games. But if you ask me, that's also why it's simply a better game in terms of gameplay. Kuon feels much more realistic in its movement and combat animations. They're heavier. Some spells even require perfect alignment to hit the target. Utsuki doesn't just automatically aim at the enemy. Same with running, walking, or simply using items. It's almost like From Software's whole story about Demon Souls. It was such a different game when compared to other hack and slash or role-playing games in that time. It's pretty much the same story. Even healing in the game is performed differently. Sure, you can use healing items whenever needed, but the game has a vertigo system. Basically, your character has an invisible health bar that also counts as a stamina bar. When you run for a long time, you run out of stamina and your character goes into a vertigo state. What this does is that it attracts enemies from your surroundings and it also blurs your sight pretty badly, making the game even harder. It panics the character and makes her do things that you do not want her to do. By doing this, the game sort of forces you to walk instead of running everywhere. By walking, you feel more methodical and it is harder to miss small details. I find this system to be very intricate and immersive. I wish more survival horror games had similar systems back in the day. What do you know? Haunting Ground has a similar system and it works great. But back to Kuon, whenever you're running and you notice that your character is getting tired, you can simply press a button to meditate. Your character stops for a few seconds, meditates, replenishes her health, and it's all back to green now. This also works for damage that you take from enemies, but it is naturally not recommended to meditate during combat as it stops your character. It's best to use healing items in those situations, but if the combat is over and you're still alive, you can just use meditation to heal yourself. The game has these kinds of pretty innovative and different mechanics, and they're not as precise and require you to do most of the handiwork. That's why you often hear Kuon to have a bad gameplay. I believe this is also one of the reasons why the game got such a bad response from game journalists back in the day. I guess they sucked at video games even then. But jokes aside, yes, unfortunately Kuon had a bad response. It currently sits at a 57 on Metacritic, although being considered an obscure classic today. But so is the case for other obscure classics really. Rule of Rose with its 59, Haunting Ground with a 67. It's not surprising to see Kuon with such scores. It is heartbreaking that these games were simply misunderstood back in the day, and because of that first response, we will probably never see them again. Another remaster, another remake, nothing. I don't even think they saved the source codes because the games failed on a surface level. Really heartbreaking to think about, and also makes you think about the current state of game journalism too. Nothing has changed. Reviews shouldn't be just subjective. They should be objective with a small amount of subjectivity. But I digress. People aren't ready to talk about that yet. Maybe in another 10 to 20 years, we'll see what happens. Anyway, without succumbing to my ADHD and distracting myself too much, going back to Kuon because I want to talk a bit about its atmosphere and horror elements before closing off the video. We all know by now that the Japanese are good at horror, right? Be it in movie form or video game form, their history, beliefs, and traditions fall in line with classic horror perfectly. As I mentioned, the game has a slower pace And I believe that's also one of its strong points when it comes to portraying horror, because when you constantly run around, shoot creatures, and say corny lines, games lose their sense of horror after just a few hours. Kuon, on the other hand, stops you from running around with a simple mechanic. It prevents you from feeling powerful, no matter how many resources you might have in your inventory. A small, simple creature could easily defeat you if you take damage too much. Vertigo begins, it becomes even harder to control the character, and you simply perish in seconds. This sometimes makes Kuon a terrifying experience. Panic and terror combined could create some of the most horrific situations imagined. The creatures you fight throughout the game are also very well designed. They all have grotesque, unique designs that we're used to seeing in From Software's library by now. The game even has some enemies that you will probably recognize if you played Sekiro before. When it comes to sound design, that's where the game shines with its atmosphere. Because you're mostly walking instead of running, you get to experience the perfect silence around the manor. Long corridors, creaking floorboards, sounds of pain coming from a distance, and when all of these merge together with the game's grotesque imagery, let me tell you that you're in for a good ride. Kuon is a good game. It's a shame that it was misunderstood, and while I'm doing my best to remind people of its existence over at Horror Games community, it is hard to do it by myself. But it's also understandable why people cannot or won't talk about it as much as other survival horror games, because there's no reasonable way to play Kuon. It is stuck in the PlayStation 2 era, and finding an original copy to play on a PlayStation 2 is the only legal option. But of course, scalpers, the bane of our existence, sell the game for ridiculous prices. So when it comes to that, naturally, your only option is to play the game on an emulator using a pirated copy. Its emulator performance is pretty stellar, at least. It might require you to do some fine-tuning, but you should be able to figure it out in no time. Please take a look at it, give it a shot. Kuon is a really good game, and it should be regarded as another From Software classic. It should also be regarded as a survival horror classic in general, not just an obscure classic. But I digress. Please let me know down in the comments what you think about Kuon. Did you play it already, or do you plan on playing anytime soon? What is your favorite thing about it? You know the drill. But alas, thank you all for watching. I know I've been very slow with uploads, but now that Twitter is rapidly turning into a capitalist shithole, I plan on spending more time on this channel and on Twitch in general. I will also be covering other game genres and not limit myself to horror. I hope you will be as interested in them. You can find all of my links below in the description. There are links to other socials that I plan on carrying the Horror Games community to. Please also remember to leave a like on the video and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. Again, thank you all for watching, and I will see you, hopefully, soon.